Point. Hello.
Hello there.
Hello, Helena. Thank you for being here and happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day to you.
I was just thinking every day for both of us, and I feel our organizations is Earth Day, but it's such a special day today to have those who don't work in environmental spaces as a collective to tune in. So welcome everybody. Are you tuning in from Australia, Helena?
Yes, I am from Byron Bay, Australia.
Wow, and I'm here from Auckland, New Zealand. So we're both on this side of the world today. As I said, good morning, but I do think it's the evening in the US. So thank you all for joining. Um, Today, I'm very excited to host this conversation with the incredible Helena Norberg-Hodge on Earth Day. My name is Briar Rose, and I'm the Director of Storytelling for Farmers Footprint. And this is the wonderful Helena Norberg-Hodge, who is the founder of Local Futures. She's a linguist, filmmaker, and author of the incredible book Ancient Futures. And she's been a lifelong advocate for local food systems, cultural integrity, and ecological wisdom. Today's theme is the story of the earth is the story of us, because we believe that story doesn't only shape how we understand the world, but it can shape how we move forward in the world together. And before I move into some questions with Helena about the power of story and ancestral wisdom, I wanted to first acknowledge her incredible work. Helena's work is very powerful because I believe it amplifies timeless and ancestral wisdom and traditional principles through her local organizations and her author writing and filmmaking. Not because it originates from us, but because it honors where this wisdom comes from. And I do believe it's our shared responsibility to name and uphold the source of wisdom from our Indigenous communities and ancestral pasts, who have carried it for generations. And uh, before this call, I was reading one of my favorite books by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, just to anchor into the energy of today's conversation. And there's a quote in there that she quotes from Gary Naban, saying that we can't meaningfully proceed with healing and restoration without restoration. And I find that incredibly profound for me to meaningfully move forward with healing and restoration. We need to come back to the stories of the land and the original peoples of the land. So without further ado, Helena, in today's conversation, I'd like to cover a few topics about story. One being story as light, story as glue, and story as web. And so, feeling into the conversation topic of story being light, I'll lead with a quote and then a question for the wonderful Helena. And the quote is that story illuminates the past, the present, and the future. Helena, can you speak into how storytelling has played a role in your life's work? What power have you witnessed in the telling of stories, especially at a local level?
Well, I have to emphasize that I see stories coming from a corporate empire that has been imposing a story telling us that as we left the land, we were better off. That on the land, everything was hardship and illness. We died age 40. And that mainstream story, that one story, is disseminated across the world today. And it's a type of psychological warfare. It's a mental pollution that we all need to guard against. And I
Mm,
think we need to articulate more clearly the story that tells us that moving away from the earth, not recognizing that we are the earth, that we are part of the earth,
mm,
is an ongoing story that we need to address directly. It is
mm,
having a particularly profound effect on small farmers around the world and virtually all indigenous people who are still land-based. They're being made to feel stupid and backward. So that story I saw coming into this ancient culture, this ancient indigenous culture that I got to know, that had the great privilege of getting to know before that mental warfare had come in. And I encountered people who felt that they were part of the earth, and their story that was told again and again is that everything is interconnected into this flow and ebb and tide of life. We are all one.
Mm-hmm.
And that peace of mind comes when we deeply recognize that truth of the inextricable interdependence of all things. So what I saw in a place like Ladakh was that Buddhism actually reinforced the ancient, more feminine, more organic, indigenous wisdom that we are part of the earth. The Buddhism made that slightly more intellectual, and particularly for men who like playing with words, Buddhism was an attractive tool, but it kept reinforcing that truth of the inextricable oneness of all of life.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
And so these people also, were not only told that all is one, but they also lived in a way that was so close to the water, to the soil, to every plant, to every human being on whom they depended. So they were part of a web of interconnectedness. So it was playing out in the real world as well. And we have to be, as we were saying, we need the story that will move us forward. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a story that needs to remind us all that the earth is our home, that there's evidence, abounding evidence, that when we move back home towards the earth, towards community, we are happier, we are healthier, we are more at peace.
Mm. Yes, I've seen in your work, Helena, that you speak into the economy of happiness as a byproduct almost of the localization that you're coming to. And I feel like that's what you're touching on there. And when I personally think back to many ancestral tribes or indigenous communities, as we have the story of disconnection and trauma and death and slaughter from these old globalized stories, there was also deep connection to each other, to their food systems, to the earth, to nature, and it also keeps coming to me this beautiful quote from Dr. Zach Bush, who says that the I think it's the original wound of humanity is that we first saw ourselves separate from nature, and it's in that separateness where all of this disconnection comes from.
No, absolutely. And we need to also remember this is not about a sort of blame game
Mm,
or trying to say that we haven't played a part, but it's really important that we look at the genealogy, at the history of this rupture. And it was force, it was enclosures, it was slavery that
mhm,
forcefully removed the majority by a very small group of people, from men, basically from Europe.
mhm,
And we have to also look at the truth that Christianity had become anti nature and anti woman at the same time. So the burning of the witches and
mm,
the telling of the story that they were evil threats was a foundational step in this rupture between humans and the earth.
mhm,
And so the again, I think it's really important now that we contrast this story of separation, of fear, of domination, and it's now linked to a war machine
mhm,
with the story of connection, the story of healing, and that we recognize that there are still maybe almost half of the global population is still more land-based. But
mhm,
if we don't wake up to changing the story of development and progress, we are contributing to them being removed or pulled away from the land.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it feels like our connection to land is more important now than ever as we move through this moment of climate crisis and disconnection amongst humanity. And, I'm hearing you speak and some words from a very dear sister of mine, Mia, who's from the Chumash tribe in Santa Barbara or Siouxton. Um, she reminded me that it's very easy to sit in divisive perspectives of what's happened and what's about to happen. I'm Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous, and we all have a part to play. And like Robin Wall Kimmerer says, the incredible storyteller, Mia reiterated that if we can simply go back to where we're from and learn the stories of those lands and the origins of those people, we then feel connected to the land, and suddenly we're all Indigenous to the earth. So in a way, we are all Indigenous, and to sit in unity, to remember these Indigenous paradigms. We all have ancestors. We all have generations that have come before us. No matter the role they had to play, we're in this powerful intersection now as humanity. Like you said, we're either getting more disconnected or reconnected. And so
Yeah,
to reconnect in ancestral stories and wisdom feels, to me personally anyway, and to many I know in this space, the most, I guess, nourishing way forward.
it is the most nourishing way forward, and I so agree about really clearly spelling out that ultimately we are all Indigenous, and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately we all want to come back home,
Mm-hmm.
our home closer to that living reality of life. We need urgently to stop the urban tide and start supporting a trend in the opposite direction. We
Mm-hmm.
need to have smaller cities that breathe, smaller cities that don't eliminate the earth and nature in them, but also are connected to the sources of food and to the wild around them. And that balance can be met because we have so many people that are able to have their hearts, their eyes, their hands engaged with a specific of the soil, of the trees that need healing. They need healing from a machine like destruction that took off with lots of fossil fuels, where we were told, oh, this is actually producing more food. We're using fossil fuels, machinery, pesticide. You know, it never produced more food. Never. It only produced more food with fewer people. So it wasn't actually more food per land, but it
Mm-hmm.
was more food per unit of human labor.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have an overabundant resource of human beings,
Mm-hmm.
and we have multitudes of projects that show when people are liberated to care for the land, when they're allowed to once again nourish it and to restore the diversity, they can produce far more per unit of land, and they're healing both the land and themselves at the same time. So there is so much evidence for the joy, the health, the productivity that comes from this economics of happiness. And
Mm-hmm.
systemically, it is about building the local fabric, not in isolation, but as part of a
Mm-hmm.
global movement of coming back home to Earth.
Sounds like it's like a local communities being activated on a global scale. Feels like the way
Yeah,
forward there. And you just
yeah.
answered a question that I had lined up about speaking into the importance of returning to traditional knowledge systems, and how it can help us navigate the crisis of today from climate to culture. So thank you for that, Helena. Um,
Yes, but I'd like to say about climate also that the story that Al Gore didn't tell us was what was happening to global business.
mhm,
It's so boring to have to bring this up, but it's the truth that global businesses, particularly at the time that climate change was becoming a big issue,
mhm,
exactly at that time, globalization in its modern form was taking off. And huge industries were being liberated through free trade to go wherever they like in the world, and they were looking for cheap labor. So they were moving into so called poor countries and setting up the giant factories there. And Al Gore told us nothing about how this process was massively increasing the use of fossil fuels
mhm,
and therefore all the emissions associated with climate change.
mhm,
Not a word about that. The story we heard was that you, as an individual in the industrialized world, don't drive your car, don't get into a plane,
mhm,
but to this day, the emissions from global trade are nowhere mentioned in the climate negotiation.
Mhm.
Nowhere mentioned, because governments are wedded to the idea that more global trade is good for the economy.
I hear you.
And more global trade is actually making the majority of people poorer
Mhm.
and making a few billionaires richer. So again, the story that we need to tell on the one side is the story that is partial, that is blind, that is linked to for-profit interests. And on the other hand, we have the stories, the multitude of stories coming from the earth, coming from people. And there is, when you look closer to the ground, you will find not only those stories, but those practical changes occurring in what we call a worldwide localization movement.
Mhm.
And really, localization is synonymous with coming home to the earth and to community.
Indeed, and to ancestral wisdom. I know in the work that we do here at Farmers Footprint, I've traveled to a lot of Indigenous communities and spoken to many elders. And as a Māori Indigenous woman myself, I've also sat here in New Zealand, and I've never heard them all at the same time say that now is the time. It's been coming, it's been building, and now feels like the time amongst all Indigenous elders I've spoken to remember that we're all Indigenous, to bring back these ancestral paradigms and to anchor into ancient truths moving forward, um, which is not globalization and industrialization. It's very much the opposite. It's localization and reconnection to each other, to community, and to the earth. I mean, and as you're speaking about the fossil fuels, the negative impacts of fossil fuels on globalization, I mean, what immediately comes to me too is the waste of imports and exports in the food system, and how connecting farmers and food producers directly to community mitigates that. So again, it's local communities. It's all in connection again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for mentioning that. You know, we've made films about that. We have animations. I hope that people will use them because that story is just not being told.
Mm,
Of the incredible waste of literally shipping oranges from California to Australia and oranges from Australia to California. The
mm-hmm,
US imports as much beef as it exports. The UK exports as much butter and milk as it imports. I mean, it's insane.
mm,
And why is that happening? Because that's what allows this extractive global economy to extract wealth to fewer and fewer corporations and billionaires. And in the meanwhile, it's not just the emissions, it's the mountains of plastic. Talk about single-use plastic. Well,
mm-hmm,
virtually everything in the supermarket is wrapped in single-use plastic. And
mm-hmm,
that story isn't even being told. So they, at this crossroads, a shorthand for talking about these two very divergent paths into the future is that this path that separates us from the earth, and that particularly since the 80s has allowed that to grow into this massive machine-like removal of people from the land and this emphasis on global trade, that is a path of disconnection. It's a path of fear. The other path is the path of connection, reconnection, and that energy is love.
mm-hmm,
So it's a choice really between fear and love. And
mm-hmm,
we need the love of a face-to-face local community to have the foundations of a healthy and secure identity. So
mm-hmm,
this is another story that we need to talk about. The healing that comes from, you know, when people have felt depressed, addicted, most of the time it's out of disconnection. It's the disconnection from others that is primary, and the disconnection from nature, which is for so many people is part of their daily life. They don't
yes,
have access to nature. So we're now seeing these wonderful healing projects as deeply disturbed people, you know,
mm-hmm,
suffering from addiction, torture victims, prisoners, depressed people, healed through being aided to reconnect in vulnerable community conversations
mm-hmm,
and connection to nature. And
Hmm.
it heals again and again.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I can one feel my immediate craving for community. I mean, most of the community that I feel is at the farmers markets. It's where I find other people that are craving that. And Helena, as the theme of this discussion is the story of the earth is the story of us, as you're speaking, I'm seeing a past where we were very connected to the earth and to its stories. And now we're being more and more disconnected through this globalization, industrialization. And you can see society's sickness of disconnect um, as just a living example of what we're speaking into here. Um, the next theme I'd like to bring into this conversation is story as glue and how story connects us to ourselves, to each other, and to the earth as we're segueing into that organically. Um, Helena, many of the communities you work with hold storytelling in their ceremonies, songs, and foodways. How does a shared narrative create cohesion, not just in movements, but in the communities you speak of?
Well, the beautiful thing that I see is that if you're talking about traditional local communities, is that there is the shared story, a shared language, but always interpreted and moderated through a true individualism.
Mm,
So, particularly in ancient Ladakh, where the culture was secure, had not been threatened either by colonialism or modern day development and globalization, I experienced that people's the the amazing thing was that there was greater individualism and greater diversity than you could possibly imagine. I saw again that with the advent of the one modern story about what you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to say, there was a fear of not being good enough. So what I saw was there was a glue, there was a common story, and there was that in most of the stories, it was the reminder of the inextricable oneness, the reminder of the peace of mind and the joy that comes from that. But there was also in the stories and in the songs an ongoing appreciation of the living world, of
mm,
the waters that flow, the birds, some stories about birds that actually take illnesses for people so that they carry them off on their wings. And but all the time these stories also told in a unique and individual way.
that's really beautiful. And again, I'm hearing and feeling that energy of interconnectedness. And although they're in a community, there's an individual honoring of all that are in that community, be it the people, be it the birds, be it the rivers and the oceans. Um, that's really beautiful to hold on to. Um, so what stories do you believe, Helena? Are there any stories at the forefront of your mind that we need to be remembering or reweaving to feel rooted again in this now moment?
Well, I think we need to remind ourselves that where we're standing today, when we look at all the evidence we have from not only indigenous people themselves, but people who were, as it were, reporting on the first encounter with indigenous people,
Mm,
the evidence we have from the again and again, their story was the oneness. Their story was we are the earth. The spirit is in us, around us, and whether it's the water or the soil, all that lives, it's one. Also, in virtually every spiritual tradition, and later on as even monotheistic religions like Islam and Christianity took off, in all the wisdom tradition, at the core is the reminder of the oneness. And and most of these, even within the mainstream religions, have that, as it were, mystical heart that
mm,
tells us that silencing the left brain mind, breathing, being in the now, we can feel it. We can feel it. And we feel that peace and joy that comes to us as we experience that sense of oneness. So that's the story for sure that
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about now again and again. But as I say, I think that contrasting it with the story that's being told from the top down, from a profit-making machine,
Mm-hmm.
now is becoming more and more difficult because we have a lot of beautiful language coming from the machine-like for-profit
Mm-hmm.
global empire that sounds like it's about respect for the indigenous people, that it's about restoring biodiversity, it's about growing more food so we can feed the global population. So we have to now be very discerning in
Mm-hmm.
not just looking at the story, but then looking at the money and where is it actually going and what are the projects on the ground. And I suppose that a key story in all of this that is not being told enough is that it is through going smaller, slower, and more local that we come home. That's where we start building those deep, real, interconnected bonds between people and between people of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be going slower, smaller, and more local. Another, so another factor in this is more feminine.
Mm-hmm.
This is not about polarizing men against women, but it's about recognizing that the patriarchal, machine-like path built on fear and separation squash the feminine in men and women.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to come back home to the more feminine. What does that mean? The more caring, the more nurturing, and again, it's the path of connection and love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. And I do believe that we are in the rebirth and the woman having the womb and the birth space. It's a very, like you said, not to be polarizing because masculine, grounded masculine has its role to play, and I so respect the sacred masculine, but to allow the feminine pathway dropping from mind to the heart is what feels like the most nourishing way forward in such a society of disconnect. So thank you for that, Helena.
I'd like to say another thing, and that is that it's again in that original situation in Ladakh, what became obvious was that in the traditional life, singing and chanting together in
Mm,
a group, not singing to perform and to be perfect and good at singing, but the joy of singing and chanting together,
mhm,
often around the fire. That I believe is another one of the gems of
gems.
tools and steps forward. It's
Mm-hmm.
coming back. We have an intuitive, ancient futures world emerging, where people are intuitively emulating what we did in our previous lifetimes, in
Mm-hmm.
our earlier generations. They're intuitively coming back. So this singing in circle is coming back. But I want to also distinguish between a choir, which is coming together to practice, to perform, which is very different from coming together on a weekly or even daily basis to sing for the joy of it. And I urge people to think about starting groups like that or trying to join them, finding them. It's a key. Also, when you look again at all spiritual traditions,
Mm-hmm.
virtually without exception, singing and chanting was part of it. So
Especially
it's
around a fire. It feels like one of the
yeah,
most primal human activities, feels like such a shallow word, but ceremonies. It feels like one of the
yes,
most primal intuitive ceremonies that
yeah,
all of us, whether white, brown, black, yellow, we've all
yeah,
taken part of that. And that feels like such
exactly.
a practical and simple way to
Yes,
start embracing this ancient future. Um,
yes,
and as we speak now into the ancient sort of futures and traditions, The topic of story is web. Story can reshape culture, change consciousness, and reweave the mythologies that we live by. At Farmers Footprint, we often say that the regenerative agriculture movement is not a new movement, but it's this remembering of our ancestral food systems and farming systems. Um, and you've spoken into something similar, that localization isn't this new science, it's just borrowed wisdom. Can you speak more about that borrowed wisdom, Helena?
Yes, well, absolutely. I don't know whether it's borrowed or recovered. It's recovered
Mm-hmm.
again intuitively as we start yearning for reconnection to the earth. And again, you can see it all around the world. Those who have been pulled into the city and, sometimes literally living in high-rise apartments where the windows don't open and you only have plastic plants. I mean, literally, there may be no life whatsoever. And you can see that people who can afford it develop very rapidly, find a plan to get back to nature. Whether that is buying a farm or buying a beautiful house in the country, where they spend as much time as they possibly can. So we're all pulled into these urban centers because of the centralizing nature of the economy, and that's where we can both earn a living, but it's also even as if we have an ambition to try to change the system, again, we need to go to the center, into the city. And
Mm-hmm.
that is again why they're going smaller, more local, and slower, is about the need for a decentralizing or localizing economic path, which will
Mm-hmm.
bring with it the empowerment of more political choice, more cultural vitality at the local level. So the recovering of that truth that we need to respect the diversity of life, that we need to be at home in life, that we need to come back to realizing that the real economy is the living earth. Every single thing we need, everything from our iPhones to every sock, every shoe we wear comes from the earth. So it's a multitude of reasons why we come back to recovering a life closer to that living diversity. And the key part of this, of the regeneration or localization, is recognizing that for hundreds of years, monoculture was imposed on the land and on humans. And again,
Mm-hmm.
the recovery of diversity is what allows us to flower, to be ourselves, to be known who we are, all unique, all different. And the same thing with every tree we plant, every animal we tend to, that uniqueness, that aliveness, that changes from moment to moment, is where the richness is where we find our joy, is where we come home and we
Mm-hmm.
can feel at peace.
Mm, beautiful. I keep hearing whenever you say coming home, it feels like this beautiful invitation to remember that we're all home here, and that we're all extensions of Earth Mother. We're not parasites. We're not, yes, we have a role to play in the disconnection, but there is enough within local community and local food systems. And as I mentioned earlier, Farmers Footprint, we are a regenerative agricultural nonprofit organization, and when you speak into local economies, this emergence of local economies and remembering their ancestral wisdom, we at Farmers Footprint have realized the significance of that recently, and we are soon introducing a channel that is called Nana, that acknowledges and honors local and ancestral food systems and ancestral wisdom, essentially bringing the culture back into agriculture, because our ancestral cultures didn't have monocrops. They ate seasonally and locally. They sat in community. Like, I think you'd be shocked these days to realize how many families don't sit at the dinner table anymore. There are these sort of small, practical moments of beauty and connection within these food systems, and food being the interconnector of or every human, no matter whether you're in a city, whether you're on a farm, whether you can have the honor and privilege of being at farmers markets or not, to come back together through these ancestral food systems feels like one of the most clear pathways forward in this regenerative movement.
And I feel there it's very important that we remind ourselves that they are more localized and diversified.
Mm-hmm.
And when we use more language, we can avoid the co-optation that's happening now when Nestle calls itself regenerative or HSBC Bank calls itself a local bank.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to use more language and more localized, more diversified,
Mm-hmm.
along with regenerative. It's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise we end up giving alibis to the opposite of what we want to spread the word about and encourage, a strong movement. And I do want to say that for me, seeing the transformation that happened in Ladakh, I had this rather unusual opportunity, I have to say. There are very few people now who have actually experienced such a truly black and white contrast between this more feminine, earth-based culture and the sudden opening up to the modern global economy, seeing food come in, butter that had been transported for weeks, selling for half the price of local butter, the hidden subsidies, supports for global trade, destroying the local economy, but more importantly, seeing people who, well, suicide basically didn't exist. Maybe an old person in a generation. And now it's probably about one a month. It's about one a month, and it's young people. And
Wow.
so this black and white nature,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so eye-opening. And in all of that, I would say that what happens to food and farming is the most fundamental area to focus on. What we do to our food, what we do to farming is what we do to ourselves, it's what we do to the planet. And so there is a central systemic reason why focusing on shifting that food economy, just as you said, to really understand those diversified, localized, community-based systems. That's why we launched World Localization Day, and we have at the center of that people organizing local food feasts around the world.
Wow.
Very important that we go smaller, more local, and slower, but that we also speed up our communication and global connection as we're doing now on Instagram to
Mm-hmm.
get the bigger story out, to get the big picture out. We need actually to speed up the communication and the connection globally so that we know that we're part of this vast global movement that is so much bigger than we realize.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, when is this global localization World Day?
Yeah, the World Localization is June 21st,
June.
which is the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I hope there can be people in your community joining in with that.
Please, please do, everybody. Go and cook a local feast. That sounds like such a wonderful invitation.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And be
Thank you.
sure to have a sing song around the fire while you do it as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It sounds, I'm in personally. All right, a final question, Helena, and I know we've touched on a lot of beautiful stories and wisdom here today. Um, but if there was one story, one ancestral truth or wisdom that you would like everyone to carry in their hearts moving from this Earth Day and forward, what would that one be? Localization. It is, isn't it?
um, I think one thing I didn't mention so far is how fundamental the connection was between the oldest and the youngest.
Oh. Hmm.
And so that was, again, when we understand the indigenous and we look back, we'll see that that's a marriage made in heaven.
Mm,
The youngest and the oldest have so much in common.
mm,
They're both toothless, hairless, they can barely walk, and
mm,
they mate for each other. And
mhm,
so experiencing on a daily basis that every mother had 10 caretakers for every child, and that life was happening at a pace and a scale that included the oldest and the youngest in a
Mm-hmm.
way that served everybody. It was a naturally collaborative structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the wisdom, yeah, the wisdom is really about looking at the bigger picture of the indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
This one element of the oldest and the youngest is fundamental. That I want to say the feminine as part of that. I want to say the constant reminder that we are part of the earth. And you see that reminder when you actually live in that way, when you have a functioning economy that rewards this behavior, you experience that on a daily basis. And you actually experience the joy of being productive and being seen and heard and belonging. I'm throwing a lot of things out here, but the other wisdom is a sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Is that child growing up knowing that whatever they look like, however good or bad they are at running or singing or tending to animals or whatever it might be, they belong and they are seen and heard and valued as genuine individuals.
Mm-hmm.
That deep belonging is something that most of us in the West miss. Most of us are neurotic. So another thing I'd like to say is we basically don't have psychotherapy based on studying healthy people. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know what healthy people look like because from Freud and Jung and onwards, we were looking at people who were traumatized by being forced into the city, into a small nuclear family, cut off from their right to genuine livelihood, a livelihood that's based on keeping life alive.
Mm-hmm.
I also just want to add that in that traditional culture, the creativity, the theater, the poetry
Mm-hmm.
was again something that was widespread. Most people developed a multitude of skills, playing an instrument, caring, building houses, tending to animals. They were multidimensional. We've
Mm-hmm.
been forced into one dimensional, functional
Specialization.
world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's many messages rather than just one.
Oh, I love it. And as you're speaking to me, it feels like they're all vehicles of belonging and
Yeah,
remembering that we do belong. And I think you're touching on that original wound of humanity and that non-belonging nature to this earth. And again, learning the stories of the earth and ourselves, our ancestors, our heritage, no matter where you are in the world, our food systems, our farming systems, feels like a really powerful way and vehicle to belong again. Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, it feels like we all just want to belong. And it gets devised with politics and all of these different paradigms. But one thing that we can come to is our humanity, is our food, is our community. Um, and through the power of story and remembering, we can anchor back into that connection with each other. So thank you.
yeah. And that's also, with as we go in that deeper connection, as we go slower, we also can listen more deeply. And we both long to be heard more. And that's
Mm,
why we both, we need to develop our listening capacities and get over the fear of speaking our truth and being imperfect. So part of this way forward is to have the courage to be vulnerable, the courage
mhm,
to be vulnerable and to develop a deeper skill of deeper listening.
mm. That's that courage of dropping from the mind into the heart, isn't it? Going from a masculine patriarchy to a feminine matriarchy and the rebirth of a humanity that
Yeah.
is more wild, more connected, more present with each other and the earth. And that comes hand in hand.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Helena. I am so
Well,
honored to hold this space as we converse on this Earth Day. For all of our network at Farmers Footprint, Helena's work can be found at Local Futures. I know they've posted a few comments during our conversation here. And there's an invitation there to join global, what is it called?
It's called World Localization Day, and it is
World
building a
Localization.
movement. We have on every continent groups celebrating this day as they come together to celebrate their connection to the earth and to each other. And very often with a local food feast. Sometimes they show one of our films and start a discussion and start new projects and initiatives from that. I also want to mention we are having a conference in Ladakh or Little Tibet, which is the culture that I was talking about, where I had these profound lessons starting in 1975. And this year will be my 50th anniversary of having gone there. And so
Wow.
we're having a conference there, and you're all invited. It'd be wonderful if you wanted to come. It will be deep discussions precisely along these lines about what we
Mm,
can learn from Indigenous culture, but also clarity about the story that we need to reject, the top-down monoculture that pushes consumer culture, urban life, romanticizes it in the media, makes people feel inferior, makes now, through social media, young people internalize this and divide they're, as we know, polarized and divided by this top-down system. So we need to have the stories that give us a very, very sharp and rapid protection against this.
mhm.
And at the same time, the invitation, the opening of the heart to where we want to go and where we belong.
Thank you, Helena. It feels like that top-down narrative that's caused division. If we flip that into the solution of a land-based, hands-on, root-based, localized narrative to reshape the future moving forward,
Yeah.
that's what I'm hearing from you. And I so appreciate that wisdom and the wisdom that you've amplified from the traditional and indigenous communities. As you said, the remembered wisdom of localization and eating seasonally and being in a community. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been a
I,
beautiful Earth Day conversation.
And thank you also as an Indigenous person who's also welcoming this universal Indigenous identity. Very
Hmm.
important to make that invitation that we all came from there once and we do want to go back home. And so it's been an honor talking to you and hope we
Thank
can
you.
continue collaborating.
Please, the honor is mine. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in today. We'll post this video, this Instagram live soon, and enjoy Earth Day. The story of the Earth is the story of us. So go and learn about where you're from, your heritage, your food systems, the original agriculture, and the wisdom that come from your ancestral lines. And that's an open invitation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Speak soon. Thank you, Helene.